Right now, one guy is being called the greatest quarterback of his generation with multiple Super Bowl rings and MVP awards, while another bounced between 4 teams in 5 years before finally finding stability. Both were first-round picks. Both were considered elite talents coming out of college. But one got developed in a stable system, and the other got thrown into chaos. Patrick Mahomes sat on a bench for an entire year before he ever started an NFL game. Baker Mayfield, on the other hand, was starting by week 3 of his rookie season. And if you think that difference comes down purely to talent, you're missing the entire point of how the NFL actually works. We've been sold a myth about how greatness works in professional football. We're told that the best players rise no matter what. You get drafted high because you're talented. You start because you earned it. And if you flame out somewhere along the way, it's because you weren't as good as everyone thought you were. It's a simple narrative, and it's easy to believe because it puts everything on the individual and nothing on the machine around him. But the moment you start looking at the actual careers, the actual timelines, the actual situations these players walked into, the story starts falling apart in ways that are hard to ignore. Before we get into the players, we need to talk about why the myth is so hard to kill. The belief that elite talent always rises no matter the circumstances is comforting because it's clean. It removes the organization from the equation entirely. It lets front offices and coaching staffs avoid accountability for throwing a 21-year-old into a broken situation and then acting genuinely surprised when he couldn't fix team structural problems that took an entire decade to create. And it gives fans a simple explanation for complicated outcomes. He was a bust. He wasn't as good as advertised. Move on, next draft class is coming. But that belief refuses to account for the fact that talent doesn't exist in a vacuum. It develops inside systems, under coaches, behind offensive lines, surrounded by rosters that either give it room to grow or crush it before it ever becomes what it was supposed to be. Patrick Mahomes is the most obvious place to start because the details of how Kansas City actually handled him are more deliberate than most people realize. He was drafted 10th overall in 2017, and coming out of Texas Tech, the concerns were real and legitimate. Analysts called him raw, called him reckless, said he was too reliant on off-script improvisation to translate at the professional level, where defensive coordinators get paid enormous amounts of money specifically to take away everything a young quarterback is comfortable doing. Kansas City heard all that and decided it didn't matter yet. They sat him for an entire season behind Alex Smith, one of the most cerebral and reliable quarterbacks of his generation. And Mahomes spent that year doing something that almost no top 10 pick ever gets the luxury of doing. He watched. He studied how a veteran quarterback processes an NFL defense before the ball is even snapped. He learned what a collapsing pocket feels like from the sideline before he ever had to feel it with pass rushers coming from both sides. He got to make every mistake a young quarterback makes in practice, in film rooms, in controlled environments where those mistakes cost nothing. And when he finally took over in 2018, he didn't look like a rookie trying to survive the speed of the game. He looked like a quarterback who had already lived through a season without the bruises to show for it. Sitting behind Alex Smith for a year was only part of what Kansas City gave him. He also inherited Tyreek Hill, Travis Kelce, a functional offensive line, and Andy Reid, one of the most creative offensive minds the sport has ever produced. There was no quarterback controversy brewing in the background, no offensive coordinator getting fired after 6 games, no regime change looming on the horizon that would mean learning an entirely new system from scratch. Just stability, structure, and a runway that was cleared specifically for him before he ever started running. But not every quarterback got that runway. Sam Bradford is worth talking about because his career is one of the clearest examples of what happens when a franchise takes the opposite approach. Bradford was drafted 1st overall in 2010 by the St. Louis Rams, and on paper, he had everything. He won the Heisman, he had the arm talent, he had the football intelligence, and he came into the league with the kind of pre-draft evaluation that made him look like a safe bet at the top of the board. What he didn't have was anything resembling the situation Kansas City built around Mahomes. He walked into a franchise that was in the middle of a rebuild with a patchwork offensive line, limited weapons around him, full weight of a fan base that needed him to be the answer before the organization had even figured out what the question was. So, he spent his career bouncing between 4 different teams over 9 seasons, learning new systems almost every other year, getting hurt behind lines that gave him no protection, and never once landing in a situation that gave his talent the same kind of platform that Mahomes received almost as a matter of organizational policy. Was Bradford as talented as Mahomes? Probably not. But he also never had a single season that looked anything like what Kansas City handed Mahomes before he threw his first meaningful regular season pass. And when you compare those two careers side by side, the talent gap alone doesn't explain the difference in outcomes. The situation does. But this behavior doesn't just affect quarterbacks. Aiden Hutchinson was drafted 2nd overall in 2022 by Detroit. And he landed in a franchise that was already deep into a cultural rebuild under Dan Campbell, a coaching staff that had spent 2 years establishing an identity before they even asked a high pick to represent it. Hutchinson didn't arrive as the entire defense. He arrived as a piece of something that was already being built around him, with veteran mentors, a defined defensive system, and a coaching staff that protected him from the full psychological weight of being a top 2 pick on a franchise that hadn't been relevant in decades. He developed into one of the most feared pass rushers in the league, not just because of his talent, but because the environment gave that talent somewhere to go. Take that same player and put him in a chaotic organization with no defensive identity, no coaching continuity, and no veteran presence to absorb some of the pressure, and the same development curve looks completely different. Same talent, same motor, same measurables, different runway. And that system that creates those gaps has never had much interest in fixing them. Here's the paradox the league has never been eager to address publicly. The worse a team is, the higher they pick in the draft. And the worse a team is, the less equipped they are to develop the player they just selected. So the most hyped, most scrutinized, most pressure-laden prospect in the entire draft class gets handed to the most dysfunctional organization in the league. And then everyone acts surprised when the results don't match the pre-draft projection. Dak Prescott is worth bringing in here because his story cuts against the grain of everything the draft is supposed to represent. He was drafted 135th overall in 2016, 4th round, not even close to a first-round pick. But he landed in Dallas behind Tony Romo, inherited one of the best offensive lines in football, had Ezekiel Elliott running the ball beside him, and stepped into a starting role only because Romo got hurt, rather than because he was thrown into a rebuilding plan. He won Offensive Rookie of the Year and never looked back. Now take that same Dak Prescott and put him in the top 5 of that draft. Hand him to a team with none of those pieces and ask him to be the answer on day 1. Does he become the same player? That's a question no one can answer definitively, but the conditions he walked into gave his talent a platform that the majority of players, taken far higher with far more organizational expectation attached to them, never came close to receiving. So what actually separates the legends from the players who disappear? It comes down to things that never show up on a scouting report: stability inside the building. The organizations that consistently produce legends aren't necessarily the ones with the best talent evaluators, though evaluation matters. They're the ones with the discipline to let talent develop on its own timeline instead of forcing it onto the organization's timeline. They build a wall around a young player's confidence while it's still fragile. They don't expose him to consequences he isn't ready to absorb. They make mistakes in private rather than on national television. And when he's finally ready, when the foundation is solid enough to build on, they hand him the keys and get out of the way. Next up, we're going inside the elusive world of practice squad players. The guys making 6 figures who still have almost no power, no security, and no guarantee that a phone call on a Wednesday afternoon won't end everything they've ever worked for. Trust me, hit that video title and give it a watch. You won't want to miss it.